Dr. Wes Howard, and we're going to talk about the blue zones today, something you may not know what they are, but you're interested and you're here, and I think you'll find this very interesting and very informative. The purpose of this talk is not a travelogue to find out about people living all over the world, but it has something to do with each one of us. And at the end, I'm going to take what we learn from this and apply it to each one of us. Here's the central thesis. Your future in terms of health is really more in your hands than you realize, or more under your control. And we're going to get at that by looking at the healthiest living people in the world. That's what the Blue Zones is about. So let's get started, and then we'll talk about it at the end. Okay, the Blue Zones. What's the Blue Zones? Kind of a weird name. It's an effort to find the longest living people in the world. And it was actually done by the National Geographic, started in early 2000. And I'm sure there's a history behind this. This is not the first time this has ever been done. But what they did was they looked for the oldest living groups of people in the world. Not individuals, but groups of people, communities of people that not only lived a long time, but obviously part of living a long time is being healthy. You don't live a long time unless you're healthy. And so this was turned into a whole series. Dan Buettner is the chief proponent, written a bunch of books, and I'll mention some of those. But let me ask you a question first, because I think this highlights. How many of you would like to live to be 100 or more years old? Many of these communities had people living 100 years or more. And if I ask an American audience, there's a little bit of a hesitation there. Why? Well, it's not so much the 100 years old, it's another question, and that is, do you want to just add years to your life? In other words, go from however old you might be to going over 100. Isn't there something else to it? Adding life to your years. If I said, how would you like to add vitality and health to the end of your life? We would all say, yes, that's what we want. We don't want necessarily years without health. And so it's a matter of life, not years. Don't you all agree? If you're going to add life, great. Finances help too. But so what we really need is a healthy, purposeful, vibrant life. And we're going to learn a little bit about that by looking at people around the world that actually had that kind of life. Now, after I gave this talk one time, I went to the Blue Zones website, and if you just put in Blue Zones, you'll arrive at it. And there's a little test you can take that asks you some questions about yourself, and then it comes up with a calculation, your healthy life expectancy. So I'm 67, I'm supposed to live to be 83, healthy. But then it said your life expectancy is 89.6 years. So it's factoring in something at the end which is not healthy, but my body may continue. My mother died of Alzheimer's, and I had her over in Bridgewater Retirement Community, and her last 12 years, her mind kept going more and more. And by the time I would last visit her, she would smile at me, and I didn't know if she knew who I was, but her life, her health expectancy was not as good as she should have had it. So here's that issue. The question about whether you want to live 100 years has to do not just with years, but also your health. And if you look at if you look at your own life, our hope for all of us is to stretch our health to as long as we can have it. Okay, so that's what this is about also. This is a picture I want you to think about, because we as a culture are like a group of people floating down a river in inner tubes. That's the picture I want you to paint for you. And we know our setting and our people around us, but we get often used to normalcy being the way everything is around us. Okay? In other words, how do we know what health is? Do we take it from the average of people around us, or do we look elsewhere? And one of the questions about our culture is like a river with people floating down the river. And the flow of our culture is what's normal to us. And oftentimes in America, we get used to what is normal in our setting, whether that's health or disease, whether that's ability or disability. And so we need some kind of perspective to better judge who we are and what condition we're in. And one of the ways that's done, how do we get an accurate view of our health or lack of health? It's not just comparing ourselves with people around us, because we tend to be like our friends, but it's also looking, maybe getting up out of that river, going over to another place in our geography and finding a different group of people and finding out what they're like. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Dr. Dennis Burkitt. I want to use him as an example of somebody who was used to bring perspective on our culture and our health. He was a doctor trained in England for years, and then at the end of World War II, he went to Uganda, which is right around here in sub-Saharan Africa, and for 20 years he worked in the Ministry of Health in Uganda, overseeing 1,000 medical centers. And over that period of time, he began to make some pretty obvious observations. One of the biggest observations was many of the diseases he was trained to treat as a surgeon in England didn't exist in Africa. One is appendicitis. So he's in England. Regularly he's doing appendectomies. He goes to Africa, never does an appendectomy for, maybe did one or two, but for 20 years he's starting to think, here's a cross-cultural observation. What? And then he looked at a lot of other things. Hemorrhoids, varicose veins, reflux esophagitis, a lot of things. My wife, my family and I lived in Kenya, where I worked in a mission hospital for 2 years, about 25 years ago. And in the entire 2 years there, I never saw a heart attack. Actually, I never saw a heart attack. And so my experience was much shorter than his, but I began to say, what's different about this? And that cross-cultural experience actually brought some revelation to what's normal for us. He became known as the fiber man because he was the chief proponent that one of the biggest differences is Africans eat a lot of plants, they have a lot of fiber in their system, and so it's fiber that, for instance, colon cancer is rare in this part of the world. Diverticulitis is rare. And he said because of all the fiber, and so he became known as the fiber man. He would carry a little bag of wheat bran around with him and eat it wherever he went. And he made a cross-cultural observation, which I'm going to hide the content of it, but he died in 1993. But he said the greatest medical discovery of the last 20 years was the understanding that, and it wasn't something that he made an observation of in England, it's something that he observed between England and Africa and then being in the United States. And that observation was our common chronic diseases are largely lifestyle related, and therefore they must be preventable and reversible. That wasn't something he discovered in the laboratory, but if it weren't for his experience in Africa, he would not have come up with this thing. And believe me, that's a revolutionary concept, only made through a cross-cultural experience. And it has led to a whole different field of medicine called lifestyle medicine, which is basically that your diseases largely come from the lifestyle that you choose. And that's what we're going to focus on. We'll see it in the blue zones. And here's the bad news. The life you've lived often creates the chronic diseases you have. And I'll enumerate on that. That's the bad news. The good news is the life that you can live in the future can in some ways reverse some of those things that maybe your lifestyle has created. So the bad news becomes the good news for many people, and it's encouraging. Okay, so the blue zones, Dan Buettner there behind the magazine, is the man who's popularized this. But this was the work of numerous people, thousands of people, scientists, anthropologists, dietitians, scientists of all kinds. And what they did is they fanned out over the world trying to find what are the longest living people in the world. And they came up with 5 areas. What's interesting is these are culturally, genetically diverse. Okay, so starting here, Sardinia, Italy, a little island off the west coast of Italy. Icaria, Greece, a little island off of Greece. Nicoya, it's a peninsula in Costa Rica. Okinawa, Japan, and then Loma Linda, California. Very interesting, very diverse, but good for us. There's one of them in the United States, and we'll learn a lot from that. Okay, let me go through each one of these. Sardinia, Italy, is this island to the west of Italy, fairly large island. And it's not everybody on this island, but it's a group of people that they found routinely had people living into the hundreds. And again, not just long life, but a healthy life also. From this picture, you can tell a lot of them were shepherds. They had sheep. So many of the men would spend their times following the sheep, a lot of physical activity. That's one of them. Okay, the next one was Icaria, Greece, a little island off of the off the east coast of Greece. Turkey's over here. And these people also, many of them were shepherds. You may know the story of this man. This is a man, Stamatis Moretus, who actually was born in Icaria. Then he moved to the United States. At age 65, he and his wife were living in New York. He was a smoker, and he was told, you have a bad form of lung cancer. And so here he is thinking about, what should I do with the rest of my life? I'm supposed to die pretty soon. So he made an economic decision. It's pretty expensive to die in the United States. I think I'll go back home to Icaria and move in with my parents. And it's very cheap to, you die there, you get put in a pine box, and it's cheap. So I'll save some money. So he and his wife moved into with his 95-year-old parents to their little cottage and started living in Icaria like he did before, resuming his old lifestyle. The years went on. He planted a little vegetable garden. Pretty soon he had a grape arbor. Over the years, he didn't notice that he was sick. And finally, he lived until he was, I think, 97 years old. What happened to his cancer? Nobody knows. It went away, stopped. So you might have heard about the island where people forget to die. Somebody was interviewing him and said, and this is one of the characteristics of these groups, nobody's out to prove anything in these groups. And they haven't necessarily figured it all out, but they're just living a life they've always lived. And somebody asked him, well, what happened to you? And he said, I guess I just forgot to die, which is cute. But here's the next one, is on the west side of Costa Rica, there's a little peninsula, Nicoya Peninsula, very remote area. And that's one of the other blue zones. This is common there. Older people, very active out in their gardens. This guy's probably in his 90s. Hoe in the ground, producing his food to eat every year. There's a very common thing that they eat, which is called the Three Sisters. How many of you heard of the Three Sisters? Okay, very popular thing. And what happens is they grow, as you can see there, the pumpkins grow as ground cover, the corn grows as stalks, and the beans grow up the corn. And this is both grown together and eaten together. So you see over on the right, 3 diverse kinds of vegetable stew that is a common thing for them to eat. Okinawa, Japan, is probably the largest island in the archipelago of Japan. Used to be an army base until 1972. This group of people in this part of the world had the oldest living women in the world for many years, and I'm going to tell you towards the end here, that's changed now. But Okinawa, the thing that's unique about Okinawa compared to the others is seaweed is part of their diet. It's not part of the diet of any other blue zones. But here's a woman out on the seashore collecting some seaweed. Another thing that tradition is, when you are born into the traditional culture of Okinawa, you're paired with 4 or 5 other, if you're a woman, with 4 or 5 other women from when you're very young, and for the rest of your life you meet with them on a regular basis, sometimes daily, sometimes weekly. And this is called meeting for a common purpose. This is one of the elements of their life. And as they begin to look at the blue zones, this is one of the things that they'll pick up, the uniqueness of their cultures. This is another thing about the Okinawans. As you'll see in just a minute, much of their diet, 67% of their diet, was purple sweet potatoes. And notice that we have, in our culture, we have orange. Now this is the total phenolic content, which is one of the antioxidants or phytochemicals. And when Wegmans opened here in town, my wife and I were part of the crazy people who went the first day. And what I noticed is something I've been looking for, Stokes purple potatoes, which I'd never been able to find. They actually had at Wegmans. And notice that that is even more nutrient dense than the Okinawan sweet potatoes. But what's interesting is in Okinawa, if you ask, what's for breakfast? Purple sweet potatoes. What's for lunch? Purple sweet potatoes. What's for dinner? Purple sweet potatoes. Now, I want to make a point. A monotonously unvaried diet is not unhealthy. It can be a healthier diet. In fact, there's a guy in Australia right now that's eating nothing but white potatoes and water in order to lose weight. White potatoes are satisfying and they have most of what you need as far as nutrients. Okay. The final one is Loma Linda, and that's interesting because it's here in the United States, part of Los Angeles. And this is not just everybody in Los Angeles, obviously. It would not work that way. But this is a group of people who are Americans. They're genetically diverse. They're not all from the same genetic stock as some of the others might be. And they live in a culture just like ours. Los Angeles, I used to live in Los Angeles when I was young, and you take a deep breath and the air hurts you. I'm sure the air now is better. But this is Loma Linda Medical Center. This group of people are Seventh-day Adventists. That's what's unique about them. You might have heard of this guy, Dr. Ellsworth Wareham. He is a cardiac surgeon at the Loma Linda Medical Center, and he was part of the early cardiac surgery program, finally retired at age 95, where he used to assist with a cardiac surgery, didn't do the main thing. And he said, well, the patients might worry that they got a 95-year-old working on them, and I better retire so they're not worried about me. But if you go to YouTube and put in his name, you can see an interview of him. Very interesting. This guy is spry. I mean, one of the things he said in the interview is, if you ask me to remember something, I can remember it like I'm 20 years old. This is a guy who obviously lived in American culture, obviously had stresses on him, but lived to a ripe old age. Now, let me just explain why the Seventh-day Adventists, some Seventh-day Adventists, go by something in Genesis about when, in early Genesis, they're told to eat only plants, basically. And if you fast forward to Genesis 9, after the flood, Noah was told, okay, before I gave you just plants, now I'm going to give you animals. So, at least from the biblical narrative, supposedly for 2,000 years, people eat plants. Okay, that's where the Seventh-day Adventists. So they went back and said, oh, this original diet, and I'm going to refer to the Daniel diet in the future, where Daniel under Nebuchadnezzar does the same kind of thing. He says, I don't want to eat all this rich stuff, just give me water and vegetables. So at one point, people were herbivores, and now omnivores. So that's why the Seventh-day Adventists, not every Seventh-day Adventist does this, but there is a group of Seventh-day Adventists in Loma Linda that are now the longest living people in the world, and they're totally plant-based in what they eat. Okay, so what can we learn and apply from these 5 blue zones? That's the point of this. So after they identified them, then obviously they're going over and figuring out what is it that makes these people live a long time, and can we figure it out to a few simple things? Well, actually, they started looking at things overlapping, things different. I mean, as I said, seaweed is not common in any of them except Okinawa. And they started focusing in on the main things at the middle. And I'm going to show you what they came up with. 9 things. Okay, sorry, 9. But these are the 9, they call them Power 9. And I'm going to give you a little label. And this is the best attempt at figuring out what do these groups have in common. What is it that is the secret of their longevity and their health? That's the whole point here. Okay, you'll see on the right. Okay, let me go down this and we'll go over this a little bit more as we go along. Moving naturally. Okay, and this re-emphasizes my point. None of these people were out to prove anything. This is just living their lifestyle. Their lifestyle happens to be very healthy and engendering longevity. So none of them were athletes. None of them went out and ran marathons. None of them went to the gym and pumped iron. But all of them were active in their lives, not just as individuals, but they also lived in a context where movement was necessary for their lives. As we get to applying this to our own lives, we live in a culture that makes movement almost unnecessary. That's one of our big problems. I have a neighbor who drives to their mailbox. It's like, okay, you can do that if you want. Maybe they're disabled, but okay. So moving naturally. You saw the little man with his garden. Many of them have little gardens. Their lives are made up of walking to their friends, walking to the store, visiting people, being very active. And that's part of it. So they weren't out to prove anything. Maybe a few of them ran marathons, but most of them didn't. So that's the point. Okay, the second one, right outlook. The first one is called Purpose Now. And I'm going to mention this at the end because I think there's a lot more here. But it's basically, they had a purpose for getting up in the morning. They had a reason for their life. Now, I bet you a lot of those people never logically thought through what their purpose was. Why? Because many of them were accepting the lifestyle of their parents and were simply doing what they thought was normal life. Okay? I'll come back to that in a minute. The downshifting, in other words, stress. They know how to handle stress. They would take naps in the afternoon. They did not live in a stressful culture, although, Loma Linda, they did. But they knew how to handle stress. And there's often cultural ways to do this. The third tier had to do with eating. And the first part is unique to, well, it's true of all of them, but in Okinawa they have a hara-hachi bu. Whenever they sit down to eat a meal, they say hara-hachi bu. And what it means is, I'm not going to fill myself up all the way. So pretty significant implications, and I'll go over those in a minute. But they basically don't stuff themselves. Okay. At the other end, wine at 5. And many of them drank a red wine. It doesn't have to be at 5 o'clock. But some people even some of the Seventh-day Adventists who basically don't believe in caffeine or wine, but some of them do. But that seems to be a commonality of many of these cultures, primarily red wine. And then the thing in the middle, and I'll show you this in detail in just a minute, the majority of what they ate was plants. How much of the majority? 95% of what they ate was plant-based. Now, again, they're not trying to make a point. This is just their culture. Now, and it's not because they didn't have food, animal products. I mean, two of these cultures are shepherds. Okinawa obviously had fish around. But even the shepherds, if you read about them, they think it's a waste of money. It's a waste to slaughter these animals and eat them. I'll sell them for grain. So even when they had the option of animal products to eat, meat, eggs, dairy, cheese, things like that, it's not that they didn't eat them, but they tended not to eat them. 95% of what they ate was plant-based. Okay, at the bottom, right tribe, belonging right tribe, again, that little, in Okinawa, that little group of people that regularly met, they had continuity in their relationships. At the other end is a very similar one, loved ones first. In other words, family comes first. This old man that moves back to Ikaria moves in with his parents. See? And then the faith-based, the majority of them have a religious orientation. That's the 9 elements. Now, so here we are floating down our culture, and we're looking at the blue zones, and we're thinking, okay, what do these people do differently than we did, and how can I take this and apply it to my life? From these Power 9, let me introduce you to what is called lifestyle medicine. And you have a sheet. If you don't have one, there's one in the back. And this is 6 elements that in the West, doctors in the early 1990s began to say, what is it that makes unhealthy people? And I'm not talking about infections, or I'm talking about chronic diseases, which has become the majority of the things that disable us as Americans. And the realization that came to it, even though there's a big emphasis on genetics, it's not primarily your genes that determines your health. Epigenetics trumps your genes. In other words, your genes don't rule your life. They load the gun, but your lifestyle pulls the trigger. So, for instance, if you have genes that would predispose you to having Alzheimer's, you can do things that will prevent yourself from getting Alzheimer's. Your genes are not your destiny. We'll talk about that in the future. Okay, but the 6 elements that they found in the West, notice it a little bit different than the Power 9: nutrition, exercise, tobacco, and alcohol. Now, notice here, the wine at 5 is a positive thing. Up here, tobacco and alcohol is a negative thing. What they're talking about is if you avoid abusing alcohol or smoking cigarettes or tobacco, those are things that will engender you towards health. Stress management, sleep, and healthy relationships. Now, interesting, sleep is never mentioned in the blue zones. Why? Because it's not important? No. Why? Every one of them seemed to be able to sleep well. It wasn't a big, there's certain things that are under the radar. You don't even think about them. You take them for granted. So, but these are the 6 things. And I, as a lifestyle medicine practitioner, I was trained in internal medicine. I've done emergency medicine for 30 years now, not doing it. But basically, when I talk to a person now, I assess their lifestyle, and if they have a chronic disease, what can they do? Not what medicines can they take, not what can they do with the medical system, but what can they do themselves that will turn that chronic condition around. And many of them can be completely reversed. Let me give you 2 examples. Type 2 diabetes. Many people that have type 2 diabetes do not know it's a totally reversible disease. I'm not saying 100%, I'm saying majority of them. And it distresses me that many type 2 diabetics have never been told that. Ischemic heart disease. What causes heart attack? Is it a lack of stents or a lack of bypasses or a lack of cholesterol medicine? No. It's a lifestyle disease, okay? And it can be reversed, but many people that have heart attacks are never told that. And there's a reason they're not told that, because if you go to changing your lifestyle, that can be difficult. The bad news can be that you have lived in such a way as to create this. The bad news extended is that if you change the thing you care about the most, things might change. And oftentimes people are not willing to do that. But that's the hope of the future for people that have these problems. So lifestyle medicine is now coming back not to medical treatment, but to altering your lifestyle so you can take the Blue Zone's message and say, how does this apply to me? What can I do with my life? Okay. So these 2. And what element? Now, here's the question. Here's 9, here's 6. Are they all equally important? Okay, if I had somebody come to me and they were working 3 jobs and working and sleeping 2 hours a night, guess what would be the first thing I would say to them? You need to get a life. You need to sleep. For them, sleep is probably a major determinant of their health or lack of health. But if you look across the board at these 6 things or these 9 things, how do you determine which is the most important? One of the classic ones to debate is nutrition and exercise. Jack LaLanne. Any of you remember Jack LaLanne? I just saw a quote from him. Exercise is king and nutrition is queen. Together they make a kingdom. Well, obviously, To him, exercise was king, nutrition is queen. Okay, how can we determine which are the most important? There may be a difference for a particular individual, but overall it's quite clear. I'm going to show you a confusing graph, but this is risk factors for death and risk factors for disease as epidemiologically determined. In the 40s and 50s, smoking was the #1 risk factor for problems in this culture. Now, what has happened is dietary risks are now the most important element in your health. And if you look down this dietary risk, smoking tobacco is second. Physical inactivity and low physical activity is way down here, number 5. And alcohol use is down here. So as far as a culture, what you eat is the most important determiner of your health. Now, we go back to Hippocrates, who said, let food be your medicine and medicine be your food. So part of the message of lifestyle medicine is what you eat will largely determine your health. Now, I don't like this pie chart, but I'll explain it to you because what they're trying to do is show you of the blue zones what their nutrition was made up of. And I don't like the fact that you don't really talk about carbs, fats, and proteins. We do that, but what's a carb, what's a fat, what's a protein? In the next thing I'll show you what they actually ate. But here's just an example of the fact that these people ate 95% plant-based. Okay, and obviously carbs are found in plants, animals, things like that. Fats are found in both also, but the name that's been given is plant slant. Because as they went around, if you have this magazine and you go through it, it's a little bit confusing because some of the charts don't quite fit, and I'm not sure if that's the philosophy of the people who wrote this or not, but there's places where you find they eat 26% dairy or something like that. But across the board, the majority of what they ate was plant-based. So let me show you something that's a little bit easier to understand because it actually talks about real things you eat. This is Okinawa. This is Okinawa, and notice 1949 on the left, 1989 on the right. There's a difference, and let's just look on the left first. So here's the sweet potato, 67%. Okay, just imagine. I mean, they must have loved them. That's all they do. Okay, sweet potatoes. And then what was rice, 12%, good Japanese. Other grains, other vegetables, legumes, which are beans, fish, meat, and poultry, 2%. So only 2% of what they ate was actually animal-based. And again, it's not because they didn't have it available. That's what they preferred. They're not being denied. Now, fast forward to 40 years to 1989, and what we see is a huge difference. I'm going to actually point those things out. From 67% sweet potatoes to 32% vegetables. That's a cut of 1/2 of what they ate. And from 2% fish, meat, poultry to 15% fish, meat, eggs, 8% dairy. So what they're doing is eating a lot less plant-based and a lot more animal-based.
The dietary guidelines recommend that we try to choose meals or snacks that are high in nutrients but lower in calories to reduce the risk of chronic disease. By this measure, the healthiest foods on the planet, the most nutrient-dense, are vegetables, containing the most nutrient bang for our caloric buck. So what would happen if a population centered their entire diet around vegetables? They might end up living among the longest lives in the world. Of course, anytime you hear about long-living populations, you have to make sure it's validated, as it may be hard to find birth certificates from the 1890s. But validation studies suggest that indeed, they really do live that long. The traditional diet in Okinawa is based on vegetables, beans, and other plants. I'm used to seeing the Okinawan diet represented like this, the base being vegetables, beans, and grains, but a substantial contribution from fish and other meat. But a more accurate representation would be this. If you look at their actual dietary intake, we know what they're eating from the U.S. National Archives, because the U.S. military ran Okinawa until it was given back to Japan in '72. And if you look at the traditional diets of more than 2,000 Okinawans, this is how it breaks down. Only 1% of their diet was fish. Less than 1% of their diet was meat, and same with eggs and dairy. So it was more than 96% plant-based, and more than 90% whole food plant-based, very few processed foods either. And not just whole food plant-based, but most of their diet was vegetables, and one vegetable in particular, sweet potatoes. The Okinawan diet was centered around purple and orange sweet potatoes. How delicious is that? Could have been bitter gourd or soursop, but no, sweet potatoes. So 90+% whole food plant-based makes it a highly anti-inflammatory diet, makes it a highly antioxidant diet. If you measure the level of oxidized fat within their system, there's compelling evidence of less free radical damage. Maybe they're just genetically have better antioxidant enzymes or something? No. Their antioxidant enzyme activity is the same. It's all the extra antioxidants they're getting from their diet that may be making the difference. Most of their diet is vegetables. So, 8 to 12 times fewer heart disease deaths than the U.S. You can see they ran out of room for the graph for our death rate. 2 to 3 times fewer colon cancer deaths, 7 times fewer prostate cancer deaths, and 5.5 times lower risk of dying from breast cancer. Some of this protection may be because they're only eating about 1,800 calories a day, but they were actually eating a greater mass of food, but the whole plant foods are just calorically dilute. There's also a cultural norm not to stuff oneself. The plant-based nature of the diet may trump the caloric restriction, though, since the one population that lives even longer than the Okinawa Japanese don't just eat a 98% meat-free diet, they eat 100% meat-free. The Adventist vegetarians in California, with perhaps the highest life expectancy of any formally described population. Adventist vegetarian men and women lived to be about 83 and 86, comparable to Okinawan women, but better than Okinawan men. The best of the best were Adventist vegetarians who had healthy lifestyles too, like exercising non-smokers, 87 and nearly 90 on average. That's like 10 to 14 years longer than the general population. 10 to 14 extra years on this earth from simple lifestyle choices. And this is happening now, in modern times, whereas Okinawan longevity is now a thing of the past. Okinawa now hosts more than a dozen KFCs. Their saturated fat tripled. They went from eating essentially no cholesterol to a few Big Macs worth, tripled their sodium, and are now just as potassium deficient as Americans, getting less than half of the recommended minimum daily intake of 4,700 milligrams a day. In 2 generations, Okinawans have gone from the leanest Japanese to the fattest. As a consequence, there's been a resurgence of interest from public health professionals in getting Okinawans to eat the Okinawan diet too.
That's Michael Greger, one of our favorite popularizers of... Now, okay. So what can we learn from this? And obviously, with the Blue Zone books that Dana Buettner wrote, they point at the end towards application to the United States. And again, not just as individuals, but as societies. What if Charlottesville is considered a Blue Zone good town? You look for bicycle paths, you look for ways that you can have not food ghettos. I don't know if there are any food ghettos in Charlottesville, but food ghetto is where you have no fresh fruits and produce, stuff like that. But how can you apply them? Here's one of the ways. This is actually not a Blue Zone example because it's back in the 1970s, but here's an example of retrofitting health back into a culture. Finland, after World War II, was found to have the highest rate of heart attacks in the world. And the Eastern province of Kerala, let me go back here, was the one that had the highest one. And so this is a graph that shows that Finland, that's the shape of Finland there, by the way, that weird shape. Finland had the highest rate of what's called ischemic heart disease in the world. And so what they did is they, as a culture, said, we got to do something about this. And so they began to work on reversing this. And some of the things they used are, a lot of people smoked. They were very much into eating meat, dairy, cheese, eggs, things like that, and a lot of refined stuff. So what they did is they had a whole program to try and change the entire culture. They had anti-smoking campaigns. They would try to convince people. For instance, they made a sausage where they started adding mushrooms instead of as much meat. They started getting them to eat berries instead of stuff. So they did a lot of changing, and here's the evidence that what they did worked. They dropped the incidence of heart attack 79%. 80% in the incidence of their heart attacks. And what's interesting is they focused this on the frequency of heart attacks with a diet that was aimed at, an effort that was aimed at reducing that. But what did they get along with that? They reduced the number of cancers by 53%. It was not a program about reducing cancers, but here's the generality. If you eat more plant-based or you move in that direction, health comes in all kinds of different ways, not just for heart attacks. If you know the adage for dementia, what's healthy for the heart is healthy for the brain. So if you find a diet or you find a lifestyle that's good for your heart health, guess what? It'll be good for your brain health too. Future reference to that. Okay, let me just go through some of these. Plant slant. Now, it's not that they couldn't eat any animal products, but they preferred that, and most of what they ate was that. And as you see with Okinawa, what tanked the longevity of the Okinawans was going to eating junk food. Here's some of the scientific evidence behind that. And let me just stop and say, there's a lot of different converging evidence that points towards us eating more plant-based. Whether it's the gut biome, the bacteria in your gut, where central to the research is the fact that the primary food of bacteria in your gut is fiber. Dennis Burkitt would love it. Fiber. He didn't even know about the gut biome. But there's a lot of other things. The anatomy of human beings is the anatomy of an herbivore. You're like chimpanzees. You're not an omnivore, although you can eat that way. And here's some of the research about eating more animal proteins can increase the risk of deaths. The association of animal and plant protein intake with all-cause and cause-specific mortality. This was from this summer in JAMA, where they looked at populations. The more animal-based people ate, the more all-cause mortality was up. The more plant-based in terms of protein, the more longevity was extended. So there's lots, and here's a graph, a little hard to understand, but the more plant-based a culture eats, Laos there, the less of the killer like heart disease and cancer. And the more hungry is the least plant-based, and you see the inverse relationship there. Encouraging a child to eat meat and dairy is pretty much the same as encouraging them to smoke. So very much like the smoking culture, a culture that's heavily into animal products as far as eating, you can see what the result is. And is it this stark? Do you have a choice of plants or animals? Well, and cheese and stuff like that. Well, for some people it is. If a person came to me with one of these diseases caused by this, I would say you better take it pretty seriously. Beans are common to all these cultures. Maybe soybeans for the Seventh-day Adventists and the Japanese, but other beans. And beans are, I say to people, eat beans 3 times a day. I'll oftentimes get a little can of beans, open them up, put a spoon in them, eat a little bit in the morning, eat a little bit in the afternoon. I'm weird though. So whole grains are there. Now there is maybe we'll talk about the gluten issue, but whole grains are really actually healthy unless you have a specific problem. A lot of people think they have gluten sensitivity that may not necessarily, that's a whole different talk. But one of the things we do when we get bread is we get sprouted grain and seed bread, and you can't find this bread on the shelf. It's in the freezer, because guess what? It's alive. That's our favorite kind of bread. So whole grain. When we learned how to mill wheat and make, wheat flour, taking the germ and the bran off, it was a step forward as far as food development, but it was a step backwards nutritionally. And, Wonder Bread that puts all that back in this, adds 12 ingredients back, does not restore your health. Cook at home. If you eat more at home, you tend to eat healthier. That's one of the adages here. Eating with friends. Eating is not just a mechanical thing, it's a relational thing. And so eating and having good relationships, that's part of our stress management. This is the Harihachi Bu and this is interesting because I think this hooks into food addictions. One of the problems I have is I like to eat too much. And that is probably something I need to work on more. You can talk to my wife about that. But it's oftentimes, and we have food companies that now make highly addictive food. And once you start, you can't stop even if you have a strong willpower. But this is something that I think is applicable to us also. Fasting, it's not in the blue zones, but it's very common culturally. I'm going to mention in a minute. Fasting, and on the opposite end, celebrating. Let me just take you to this passage in Daniel. Everybody know about the Daniel diet. A lot of people have practiced that. But let me just give you the context. Daniel was a young prince from Israel that's taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar. He comes to Nebuchadnezzar's court. And what's interesting about Nebuchadnezzar's court is, as you find with all royalty or all rich people in the world, once you can find it with the pharaohs in Egypt, you can find it with the royalty of Europe. Once you're rich and affluent, you want to eat rich food. And so Daniel, who came from a Hebrew culture where they practiced fasting and feasting, but they didn't fast all the time, they didn't feast all the time. He comes to Nebuchadnezzar's court where, guess what? They're feasting every meal. Rich food. And so he says, wait a minute, this is going to trash my brain if he wants my brain to be a smart guy for him. And so, as you know, they say, hey, just give us water and vegetables. And within 10 days, they notice a difference. That's how powerful a plant-based diet can be. Okay, let's go back to these. And let me make the application here. If you want to find these, search on the web and just print it out and look at these. And here's the take-home message. If you look at these elements in the blue zones and you look at the things in lifestyle medicine and you look at your own life, you think, okay, most of you will have one thing right up front. Okay, obviously this is something I need to work on. Now, when we talk about nutrition, do we say that everybody must eat only plants? No. Here's the point. The closer you go, if you're living here and you love your bacon and eggs and cheese in the morning, am I saying you can never have that? No. What I'm saying is, if that's the primary thing you eat, very likely you're going to have some of these problems. If you move in the direction of more plant-based, you will reap benefits no matter how slight that may be. If you do it significantly, you'll have more significant impact on your health. But there's things about each one of these, whether it's the Power 9 or whether it's the lifestyle medicine elements, there's things that you can do that will improve your life in the future. I mean, one of the things that we commonly worry about is exercise. We all feel guilty about exercise. Now, some of us in this room, maybe not. But we should all exercise more. Then you get into the debate, which is the best exercise, extreme, CrossFit, all this stuff. Well, actually, any exercise you do is better than not doing it at all. We know that, and yet if we do more, it will impact us. So these are elements that you can take home. And let me just let me just step back and say, you know what, this is actually really pretty simple. This is not complicated. This is not rocket science. What's interesting about the blue zones is nobody in the blue zones had any point that they were making. Yet we live in a culture where when people go looking for advice about health, you get these emails, and they oftentimes will give you a little teaser. If you want to know how to be healthy and protect your brain from Alzheimer's, come on in and I'll tell you. And they oftentimes will not tell you up front. It's way down at the bottom. Oftentimes you have to pay for something, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, if you buy my supplement and you take this, then you'll protect your brain. So there's a lot of things out in our culture, and there's a lot of confusion because you get differences of opinion. But here are 5 cultures that were just living their lives. You look at them, very simple. They are applicable points to each one of us. There's things that you can take home from this that if you begin to do it, and some of it's hard to do. Let me give you one thing that I've thought about. This thing about having a purpose when you wake up in the morning. The more I've thought about that it's hugely applicable to us in a way that isn't straightforward. And let me put it this way. A lot of us, and maybe as you enter into retirement, it's kind of like, what is my life about? Just existing one day at a time? Okay, you've got to have something that you're living for. That something needs to be centrally positive and important. It's a reason to get up out of the bed in the morning and live your life. But the other interesting element about that is it has to be something that's positive enough for which you're willing to discipline your life. The positive has to have with it what seems to be a negative thing. You discipline your appetites, you discipline your laziness, you discipline your fixation on the computer or the internet or something. I mean, none of you have that problem. But if you have something for which you live, it animates your whole life. But it also animates the necessary part that we in America have often forgotten, and that's the need to discipline ourselves. Think of the Olympic athlete who wants to win the prize, but much of that is a hard discipline of forcing themselves to practice and routine, to eat a certain way, to sleep a certain way, and without that negative discipline, they would not accomplish a positive goal. So I bring that up as something I've thought about that applies to every one of us. What is the purpose for which you get up out of bed in the morning? Does that give you life? Is it life-giving? Is it something that you say, I want this so much, I'd be willing to sacrifice some of the things I like the most? If, as a lifestyle medicine doctor, somebody comes to me, I find that a lot of people don't want to hear this, but if somebody comes to me and says, I've had this type 2 diabetes, or I've had this problem for long enough, I'm sick and tired of being a patient. I want to get well. I'll do anything. And if they say that, then I say, okay, I can tell you some things you can do. No guarantee it's going to get rid of it, but it'll move you in the direction of being healthier. So there are things that we can do that will improve our life. And my hope is that as you take these home and look at them, that you can come up with something. Here's a little quote that in Science 2002, Walter Willett, who's at Harvard, noted that 70 to 90% of the risk for diabetes, heart disease, cancer, autoimmunity is due to the environmental factors. The environmental factors are your lifestyle, including exercise, but also what you eat. The genes do not drive most chronic diseases. It is the environment. It's the time we stop blaming our genes and focus on the 70% under the individual control that is the real solution of the healthcare crisis. So think of what we are facing in our country. When you look at the projection of diabetes in our country, which is a reversible disease, it will totally bankrupt us if we don't tackle that and turn it around. And it's not a new supplement, it's not a new drug, it's not a new form of insulin that's going to change that around. It's lifestyle, pure and simple. It's how the people live, how they eat, how they exercise, things like that, that will turn it around. And that's true for every one of you. So that's our hope. That's what we should put our efforts into. Who is the guy from Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, that he and his wife are going to give $3 billion to conquer all diseases? I thought, wonder where that's going to go into research and some new drug or something like that. Well, the way to conquer disease is to alter our lifestyle to where we can be healthy. So we are a culture floating down a stream, and this is not just a travelogue to take you in another part of the world and say, you know, there's some people over in Okinawa, there's people over in Ikaria, but to say, take some of these lessons, apply them to your health, and have hope that in the future you will be getting more and more healthy, not more and more diseased. That's our hope from these. So a healthy, purposeful, vibrant life. It's most of it is in your hands. That's the end. And there's some, you can take this sheet. It basically explains lifestyle medicine, explains what I'm doing. So with that, I think I'll end this.